This is Patrick O'Shaughnessy, and this is the third part of the module on spatial graphing techniques, part of the InTERACCT series. In this third part of the module, we will discuss some case studies from the scientific literature in which spatial graphing was used in a variety of occupational settings with the objective of making you aware of the many uses of spatial mapping and the information obtained and displayed when using them. So in this example from Peters et al., they performed a spatial mapping process in an engine machining and assembly facility. So to be more specific, they utilized a one sample location at a time approach. As shown, they placed a number of different samplers on a cart, including an optical particle counter and a condensation particle counter, an aerosol photometer, and various particulate matter meters, PM meters. They then moved the cart from sampling place to place within the engine machining assembly facility that contained these three separate areas. One for cam and crank production, another for block, head, and rod production, and a third for assembly. Here are the spatial maps they created after a campaign of sampling in the winter. The crosses indicate where the sample locations were placed, and the plot on the left shows particle number concentrations, while the plot on the right shows particle mass concentrations. Right away you can see that in one section of the plant, the block, head, and rod area, particle number concentrations were much higher than particle mass concentrations, whereas the crank area shows just the opposite. Mass concentrations are higher. This provides an example of differences in particle concentrations detected by different sensor types. In this case, one area is dominated by submicron particles and the other by particles large enough to contribute to a significant mass concentration. The study team also sampled in the spring when there was much more natural ventilation throughout the plant. From the standpoint of seasonal variations, these measurements indicate much lower concentrations of both types due to increased dilution ventilation throughout the plant. This emphasizes the ability of spatial graphing to easily communicate the condition of the plant air quality as it changes over the seasons in all areas of the plant, whereas the winter plot showed differences between areas when concentrations were high. Now, in an article by Sudama et al., spatial graphs are shown in which they map occupational hazards with a variety of sensor types in a heavy vehicle manufacturing facility. They measured particulate matter, PM, ozone, the O3, carbon monoxide, CO, and noise. In this case, they were interested in the short-term change in air contaminants that occurs when the plant starts up during the morning shift. So they did a mapping routine very early in the morning before workers arrived, and then one soon after they got the plant up and running to emphasize the increase in concentrations associated with the work activities in the plant. Also note the plots in the bottom right of the noise measurements. Noise was in a relatively normal range around 80 decibels and pervasive throughout the plant with little noticeable increase during production periods. So there is little spatial variation as indicated by the consistent color throughout the plant floor for noise. In the pair of figures on the top right, it's clear that carbon monoxide concentrations are highest in the lower left corner of the plant, indicating that there is a carbon monoxide source at this location. This is in contrast to the pair of figures on the top left for PM, where PM is more concentrated and likely being emitted from a process in the upper center of the plant. Evans et al. Were looking at ultrafine particles in an automotive gray iron foundry. Here are examples of spatial maps obtained from several sampling campaigns conducted during winter months. The authors admitted that there was quite a bit of difference in particle concentrations depending on the sample day, and that they could not readily explain why those differences occurred other than to conclude that they demonstrated a lot of day-to-day variation in concentrations. Note also that the plot in the center had far fewer sampling locations than the other two, which resulted in less refined contours. Regardless of these limitations, this study demonstrates that some plants can have complex indoor atmospheres with a variety of sources that may contribute contaminants at different times, even within the same season. Here, plots for respirable mass are shown rather than particle count. Much like the results of the Peters et al. Paper, mass concentrations are centered over different areas relative to areas where particle counts dominate. This can occur when different particle sizes are created in the same plant. For example, larger particles by grinding operations versus much smaller particles associated with welding and other combustion-related operations. Likewise here, where mass is higher, is where you might focus on concerns related to exceeding the respirable dust standard versus areas where there is higher particulate loading by count but are not necessarily going to exceed a standard. Dash et al. Performed one of the first published spatial mapping studies in 2005. They characterized fine particles when using an older wet machining process in an automotive plant. This contour plot demonstrates the use of more sophisticated software in which a fairly detailed diagram of the plant floor, covering a very large area, is layered behind the contour plot showing obvious hotspots, the red and brown colors relative to the other green-colored areas. And as you can see here, this is a map that plots particulate matter less than 10 microns, or PM10. Here, a contour plot of fine particles is shown for the same facility. The concentrations are a bit more homogeneous than the plot for PM10, but the same areas on the top of the diagram have higher concentration. This suggests they focus on those areas in terms of which sources are emitting the particles and how they could better be controlled. Park et al. Mapped PM in a restaurant in a plant performing machining in a die casting area. As shown here, the kitchen contained an oven and a grill, which were noted as obvious sources of PM. Because of the presence of these sources, sampling efforts were maximized in the kitchen area of the restaurant. Likewise, in the plant, the die casting area contained furnaces and the repair area contained a welding station. The furnaces and welding station were assumed to be sources of PM in that plant as well. Now, just looking at the restaurant, as expected, the coarse particle number concentration, which included particles with aerodynamic diameter between 0.3 and 10 micron, was highest in the kitchen near known sources, whereas the bar and seating area concentrations were much lower and more homogeneously spread throughout those areas. The fine concentration map shown on the right clearly shows a single hotspot of emissions associated with the oven, which was then investigated to determine how they could be better controlled. In the plant, the coarse number was rather homogeneous throughout, as you can see here, whereas the fine number showed more localized sources. The authors suggest that the die casting area on the right had multiple particle sources, including machining, die casting, melting, trimming, and welding, but that the die casting process itself most likely produced the highest number of incidental nanoparticles that increased the fine numbers in the area. So through these case examples, a variety of uses of spatial mapping were described. By utilizing spatial graphing techniques, contaminant concentration throughout a plant can be plotted to aid in communicating hazardous areas. These graphs can help identify contaminant sources and identify changes over work shifts or between seasons of the year. Admittedly, the sampling campaign conducted to create these plots is more intense than when performing personal or area samples of an industrial area. Prior consideration needs to be given to the number and location of sample sites as well as the map grid resolution. Then, depending on resources available, a decision as to whether to use multiple sensors fixed around an entire area, all giving information at the same time, or one sensor moved around the area must be made, where the one sensor approach requires consideration of temporal changes over the sampling time. Thankfully, there is readily available vendor-supplied software for conducting the mathematical interpolation needed, as well as for plotting the spatial graphs.
This lesson has been created by the Interdisciplinary Training, Education, and Research Activities for Assessing and Controlling Contaminants from Emerging Technologies Program, a collaboration of the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, the University of Iowa College of Public Health, and the University of California, Los Angeles Fielding School of Public Health. Funding for InTERACCT is provided by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences of the National Institutes of Health. The content of this lesson is the sole responsibility of the developers and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes of Health.